Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Future of Scientific Conferencing workshop, and to track 2, which is focused on environmental sustainability of scientific conferences and meetings. My name is Sydney O'Connor, and I'm a health scientist administrator in the Office of Behavioral and Social Sciences Research at the National Institutes of Health. I'm also one of the co-chairs of the Future of Scientific Conferencing workshop planning committee. So I'll be moderating this panel session focused on sustainability in motion, charting a greener course for academic travel and career progression. In this panel session, we'll hear a brief presentation from each speaker, and after all of the presentations, we'll engage in a group moderated discussion, including questions that are submitted by all of you in the audience. So at any time in this session, please feel free to use the Q&A function to submit your questions for each of the speakers or for all of the speakers. You can also use the chat function to share your thoughts and engage in discussion throughout the session. I'm pleased to introduce the speakers for this session, and I want to preemptively thank all of the speakers for joining us today from wherever they're located across the globe. For additional information about each of our speakers, you can access the speaker biography and headshots located in the LabRoots platform. Our first speaker today will be Dr. Tamara Ben-Ari from the French National Institute for Agriculture, Food and Environment. Our second speaker will be Dr. Lorraine Whitmarsh, Professor of Psychology at the University of Bath. And our last speaker will be Dr. Sarah Ackerman, Associate Professor of Social Behavioral Sciences in the School of Nursing at the University of California, San Francisco. So it's my pleasure to turn it over to our first speaker, and we'll begin now with the first presentation by Dr. Tamara Ben-Ari.
Hi, thank you very much, Sydney, and thank you very much for the invitation. So today I'm going to briefly talk about a few studies that we have made on trying to understand the determinants of the carbon footprint of academic traveling, and also more broadly. And very rapidly, I'm going to talk about a few pathways for reduction. But first, I want to say a word about the project that I have founded with Olivier Bernet, who's an astrophysicist, 5 years ago, which is named Labos 1.5, and it's a research action project that is aimed to estimate, understand, but also try to reduce the carbon/environmental footprint of research from the bottom up. So what did we mean from the bottom up? In France, research is organized around research units, which are called labos, hence the name of our project. So research unit is basically like a research department. It can be in one or several buildings. Usually people work on a common research object. The size can vary greatly from a few dozens to a few hundred researchers, but also any type of staff, and all of them are hired by public research organisms and universities. So one of the first things that we have done when we created this project is to build a free online open source tool, which is called GS or GHG 1.5, which is tailored for research units and enable them to estimate their carbon footprint along a series of sources. You can see here on an example for an average research unit in France. So you have heating, electricity, commuting, but also traveling and purchases. And this tool can also enable to estimate the mitigation potential of a series of options that you can see here on the left right-hand side, in which it's possible to try to test the effect of a series of mitigation options on the overall carbon footprint of a research unit. Sorry, I didn't use the right button. But the tool is also tailored so that all those assessments, GHG assessments, are gathered within one common national database. And if we look at the adoption rate of this tool in France over the last 4 years, it was launched in September 2020. And you see that it has gone through quite a linear growth within the French research community to reach about 1,000 research units who have now estimated their footprint for 1 or several years. Just to give you an idea, 1,000 research units, it's about 1 out of 2 or 3, depends how you count, research units in France. So quite a high adoption rate, and this provides us with a database that we can look at to try to understand a little bit more the structure of the carbon footprint of research. So if we look at this database here, there are a few take-home messages. First, on the left-hand side, the average over the parameter that we have considered. The average footprint per staff member in research units is a little over 7 tons of CO2 equivalent per year, per capita. Now, if you look at the graph on the right-hand side, what you see is the dispersion of estimation for all the sources that I have shown before with the same color coding. And if you consider that the y-axis is a log, so the CO2 per capita as log, you can see that purchases and travel are the two most dominant sources of emission at the scale of research units. Travel isn't dominant on average, purchases, but travel is the second source. And it's about 1.5 tons of CO2 equivalent per person. Now, if we look at those traveling data a little bit more closely, I'm going to walk through this graph. So it shows the distribution of trips per distance. The distance is on the y-axis, log still, and corresponding GHG emissions. So first, on the right-hand side of the graph, what you can see is the number of trips that were taken by French researchers in those 1,000 research units. So it's about 130,000 research trips. Over short distances, these are made by car or train, and plane over longer distances. And on the left-hand side, you have the corresponding GHG footprint. So perhaps one of the first things that we can see when we look at this graph is that, of course, plane emission overwhelmingly are overwhelming on the GHG footprint of traveling source, and car and train are negligible. But there are other things that can be learned from this graph, and specifically, if you look at the purple lines on both sides, which represent the cumulated fraction. So first, on the right-hand side, you can see that 75%, so the majority of research trips that are taken by French researcher or research personnel are below 1,000 kilometers. Just to give you an idea, 1,000 kilometers is basically the size of France. If you want to go on the diagonal in France, so it's all mainland trips, but also trips in neighboring European countries. So these are dominant, but in terms of footprint, they aren't dominant anymore, because you have half of the footprint, which I have indicated here on the left-hand side, which is actually above 6,500 kilometers. And 6,500 kilometers is the distance between Paris and Washington. So half of the traveling footprint for French researchers are actually above a distance between France and the US, for example, or at least intercontinental flying. In this data, we can also gather other types of information, such as the fact that conferences make up for a third of travel motives, and fieldwork, which is about 10% of the travel motives, across distances, become more prevalent over long or very long distances, which means that this peak that you have for GHG emissions for very long distances that are traveled by plane are sometimes or often traveled because to gather observational data or to conduct surveys. This graph here can already tell us some information of the mitigation potential of decisions or policies. The first one you can see on the right-hand side is that there are distances that are traveled by plane that could be traveled by train. So this is a modal shift from plane to train. This is possible in France and in Europe, of course. It's not the case everywhere. But actually, the mitigation potential of this modal shift is quite small. It's capped at about 20% of the total GHG footprint of traveling in research. Most of the mitigation potential is over long distances, and this means the consequences of this is that you need to have complicated discussions in terms of fieldwork, but also, of course, conferences, international networking, scientific objectives, etc. Now I'm going to go through a second study, which is based on a national survey that we conducted in 2020 over so it's a random sampling of the totality of the research community affiliated with the biggest research organism in France, and in which there was 6,500 answers. And so we asked a series of questions to a research personnel in our project. And the first one was, to what extent are you concerned or preoccupied about climate change? And you see that over 70% of the respondents say that they are very or extremely preoccupied with climate change and its consequences on the environment and societies. But if you ask those same people that, whether they have ever canceled a business trip for environmental reasons, then the majority of them say no. Of course, this disconnect between opinions and practices are extremely common. And I'm sure my colleagues are going to talk more in depth about that. But this motivated us to try to understand some of the structural reason as to why people fly, although perhaps they wouldn't want to in terms of their beliefs. And so we have looked at the relationship between the number of business flights in the research community and the 3-year publication rate. So this is only focused on researchers and scientists and professors and associated professors within the research communities. On this graph here, you see just a display of the data, and you can see that there seems to be a positive growing relationship between the number of flights and the 3-year publication rate. And this is also perhaps more visible on the right-hand side of the graph. If you look at the marginal probability distribution, so for the red box on the left-hand side, for researchers who do not fly, 0 flights, their most probable publication rate is about 1, 10 exponent 0. And on the other hand, for the blue box, for scientists who've flown actually in 2019 more than 20 times during that year, the most probable publication rate is 10 publication. This relationship is altered by gender, disciplines, and age, so we had to control for that in a statistical model. And on this graph, you see the relationship from the statistical model, which is robust and significant, even if you take into account those factors. And you can get a few take-home messages. The first one is that you have a hierarchy of disciplines. You have disciplines that fly more and publish more, but the effect is similar across disciplines. You have a gender effect, which is expected. Decreased marginal gain, if we could say, of flying on the publication rate, and we find similar results with the H index. Of course, a correlation and causality are two different things. Sorry for the slide. There can be many different mechanisms at play. An exposure effect in which scientists who travel more obtain more scientific visibility, citation, collaboration, and at the end, papers. Or reputation effect in which scientists who are more visible because of their work are more often invited and travel more. And perhaps we shouldn't think about that in terms of causality or deterministic relationship, but much more in terms of an interacting process or elective affinities which lead to those practices. To conclude, I just want to say a few take-home messages in terms of our work after 5 years of working on this subject. We find that the research community is extremely well informed and concerned and active, but this consensus hides very important divergences when it comes to how we should decrease, how we should mitigate our footprints. And overall, the research is somewhat passive and fragmented regarding mitigation options. I'm just going to give a few examples. Among the 1,000 units that have estimated their footprint, only a handful of them have actually moved beyond awareness raising and have taken mitigation decisions with an effect on reality. In those discussions that were occurring in research unit, the organization of research in terms of its financing and evaluation, etc., is merely discussed, and most often are considered individual eco-friendly actions. And the structural inequalities in terms of flying, which I haven't shown here, that we analyze in the articles that are cited, are seldom considered. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Benary. Our next presenter will be Dr. Lorraine Whitmarsh. When you're ready, go ahead, Dr. Whitmarsh.
Hi, and thank you very much for the invitation to be joining you. I'm hoping that you see the slides. Okay. So I think what I want to talk about builds really nicely on what Tamara has just presented, and so I don't really need to give too much in the way of context here. As you've just seen, travel is one of the biggest emitting activities of science and research. And from our point of view, we were interested in whether really the disciplinary differences, I guess. So that was just indicated in some of Tamara's findings. But we wanted to know in particular whether climate change researchers, who you might think should know better and maybe are more motivated to reduce their travel and their carbon footprint for work, do they fly any more or less, or any less than people that study other things? And we know there is research actually that this matters. This is not just a scientific question about what's the role of knowledge, but actually there's evidence to suggest that climate scientists who reduce their carbon footprint are actually more credible as advocates for climate action when their behavior is in line with their advocacy position. So if they're actually walking the talk, so to speak, then they make better advocates. However, we do know that climate change knowledge tends not to be a very strong predictor of climate change behavior. So within the general public, what you know about climate change often has a very small effect on the actions taken. We know that wider structural, social, economic factors tend to have a much bigger impact. So in this research, we were asking the question, really, does climate change knowledge translate into low carbon travel amongst researchers? So within this academic community. So we did two studies, a correlational one and an experimental one. And this was before COVID. And so in the first study, this was a really big international survey of researchers and scientists around the world. We sampled 30 universities, very diverse universities, some of the most prestigious ones, some kind of mid-ranked ones, some less well-known ones, and a range of disciplines within those different institutions, ranging from biology and chemistry through to history and music and environmental sciences. We identified email addresses for over 10,000 individuals from those universities. And we pestered them to fill in our survey. And our final sample was just over 1,400 respondents, nearly an even gender split from lots of different countries. And the key way in which we analysed the data was to disaggregate people who said that climate change or sustainability was a major part of their job versus people that said it was either a very minor or not at all a part of their research. And we measured behaviors, attitudes, and lots of other things. And really the sort of headline finding was that climate change experts actually took more flights per year than people that studied other things. So the experts, what we call experts here, are the climate change specialists, and the non-experts are people that study everything else. So in fact, the climate change experts took at least 2 to 3 flights per year compared to 2 flights per year amongst the people studying other things. And that's a significant difference. So that was contrary to really our expectations, where we thought, if anything, we would hope climate change researchers might fly a bit less. And this is despite, I won't show all of the other attitudinal and knowledge findings, but we did find that climate change researchers were significantly more knowledgeable and concerned about climate change, as you might expect. And this finding was actually picked up by the media in the UK, who basically quite rightly pointed out that this appears to be hypocrisy. So a rather jubilant headline in the Times saying climate change experts fly more than other scientists. But it gets worse, because in actual fact, when we did a regression analysis showing, looking at what predicted the amount of flying for work that people did, we found that indeed climate change expertise was one of the strongest predictors, but so was seniority. So actually, the more senior you are, the more flying you do, and that actually climate change professors, the most senior climate change experts, are amongst the most emitting, they do the most flying. We also found that location was a predictor, so there was less flying in the UK and Europe than in other parts of the world, perhaps because we have more land-based options to travel. Conducting field work was also a predictor, in line with what Tamara just showed as well. But what we really took home from this was that, well, clearly knowledge by itself does not lead to behaviour change. Far from it, in fact. There is a negative relationship between knowing about climate change and the amount of flying people do for work. And we also were able to ask people, well, if you fly for work, why is that? And here this sort of starts to shed light on why people fly. The top reason given by both groups was that it's more convenient than other modes of travel. So it might be quicker, for example. But people also said it helps them maintain and develop research relationships, that they also value the opportunity to visit parts of the world, that it would be difficult to do the research without flying, and that it's to some extent cheaper than alternatives. So this kind of highlights some of the institutional, structural, economic drivers of flying behaviour at work. Briefly, I just want to also say something about what we did in study 2. This was the experimental study. So here we were basically trying to see, well, there's clearly a correlation between having more knowledge and actually flying more. But what happens if you provide people with information about climate change, the climate change impacts of travel? Does that influence researchers' travel attitudes and behaviour? So maybe we could actually increase people's intention to reduce flying. And does it matter whether you care about the environment or not? So that was one thing we looked into as well. In this particular experiment, we collected data online. We gave people information either that was quite a factual piece of information about the environmental impacts of flying, or we drew attention to the unequal distribution of responsibility and impacts of climate change. So we pointed out that wealthier countries and individuals are flying more, and the impacts of that are going to be disproportionately more amongst more vulnerable, poorer, developing countries, etc. And then we had a control condition that didn't read anything at all about flying. And just to give you a snippet, this is only an extract of some of the information that we provided. So this was the more kind of technical information, as it were, the first condition I mentioned, where we were just describing what the environmental impacts of flying are. So you can see some context there. We drew attention to the fact that academics and researchers often travel, and that's a big part of their carbon footprint. And that one of the ways that we can reduce our carbon footprint is particularly to fly less and use alternative modes, or even to do virtual video conferencing. And so basically what we found when we did some regression analyses was that indeed providing this information to our participants did increase their intentions to reduce flying. So they were willing to reduce flying more, having read the information we provided. Also, we found that people that care about the environment more were willing to reduce flying more, as that makes sense. But there was also an interaction effect. In other words, people that received the information about climate change impacts from flying and who cared about the environment were particularly affected by that information. And we also found the same effects, not just on intentions, but also on support for policies, institutional sorts of policies that can encourage researchers to fly less. In this second study, we also were able to look at what predicted workplace travel, and we find broadly consistent things from study 1. So we found that having children, in this case, predicts flying. So that speaks to the kind of convenience, maybe not having enough time to maybe go by train. But also, again, we find field work is a predictor, climate expertise is again a positive predictor. And here, taking personal flights, so the more you fly for leisure and holidays, also is correlated with how much you travel for work, interestingly. And we think possibly this could be a proxy for income, which then would be consistent with the seniority finding from study 1. Before I finish, I just wanted to mention very briefly other work that we've done within our centre, which is the Centre for Climate Change and Social Transformations. So my colleagues, including Bryony Latter and Claire Houlihan, have explored really what academic institutions are doing to reduce their carbon footprint and to reduce flying in particular. Amongst the many things they found, they've shown that around a third of UK academics think that their university is doing enough on climate change. So a majority do not think that their university is doing enough. Most also feel that funding processes do not incentivize low carbon approaches to research, for example, reducing flying. And they want to see a change in research culture to tackle climate change. So there is support for change to reduce flying and reduce emissions more generally. And the most recent work that my colleagues have done includes an online workshop with 65 researchers from around lots of different countries at various career stages to explore how to reduce flying in a way that also considers inclusivity and diversity. So it is, of course, you might in some cases need to have a lot more money and time to use alternatives. So how can we reduce flying while also making that an accessible alternative to people? And what you see here is an extract from that report, which is available online. I put the link there, which shows the various recommendations that have come out of this work. So this is about improving virtual ways of working, providing other sorts of accommodations for virtual work, normalizing not flying, making land-based travel the default, including emissions within criteria that for evaluating funding, for example, allowing travel budgets to be reallocated so that you aren't penalized if you don't travel somewhere, supporting low carbon travel more generally, and disassociating busyness from excellence, interestingly. So yeah, just to wrap up, contrary to what we expected, and I would say rather embarrassingly, climate change researchers travel and fly more than other researchers. This is only partly explained by needing to do more field work, and it's despite that group having more environmental knowledge and concern, and that the most senior climate change experts are the ones that fly the most. Information provision does help to increase people's intentions to reduce flying and to support policies to achieve that. But clearly there is a gap between these intentions and behaviour. So flying really is a product of more structural and social factors than it is about individual factors like knowledge. And there is broad support amongst the research community for institutions to actually address these social and structural factors. And I think that probably leads me on to the next talk, but just to say there are online resources there if they're of interest. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Whitmarsh. That was really exciting presentation. Before we get into our last presentation of the panel, I just want to remind our audience that you can feel free to submit questions at any time, and those are being compiled for us to pose to our speakers during the moderated discussion. So now I would like to introduce our final presenter of this panel session, and that is Dr. Sarah Ackerman. Dr. Ackerman, go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Sydney and colleagues, for inviting me to join this important workshop today. So my talk is actually following, I think, pretty nicely after Tamara and Lorraine's talks. I'm going to be speaking about a small project that we did at my university, University of California, San Francisco, about the culture of academic travel. And what we really mean by culture is we took sort of our foundational assumption that academic travel is sort of a collective practice and guided by rules and norms that are both explicit and implicit and often override individual priorities or concerns. So the context of this project was the early months of the pandemic. We realized that, of course, everyone's travel had mostly ground to a halt, and that might be a good opportunity for us to reevaluate how we travel, why we travel. Really quick background. I think that this has already been explained, that in the world, the transportation sector accounts for almost a third of GHG. And the health sector that I work in is a huge emitter. The US health sector emits 25% of all global healthcare emissions, and about 9% of total US emissions. But these numbers do not include travel at all. At my institution, we have tried to estimate emissions from business travel in particular. It's very hard to do. Happy to talk about this in the discussion if anyone's interested. It's a really inadequate measure. Our Office of Sustainability thinks that the total emissions from business travel are probably about a third of all of our emissions. So we conducted a series of focus groups with faculty at UCSF in 2020. We tried to have a really diverse group of faculty across career stage. We have 4 different schools at UCSF, and we wanted to make sure that we also captured gender and demographic diversity. So we talked to 17 different people, and I'm going to jump right into some of our findings. So we kind of organized them by stage of where we were with the pandemic. So we asked people to think back to their travel habits before COVID hit us. And we found that, of course, this is sort of confirming what Lorraine and Tamara both said, is that, of course, academic travel is seen as highly valuable. It does promote long-term relationships with colleagues and collaboration across distance. On the other hand, we did hear from quite a few people that they felt travel also created some problems for them. It might disrupt their laboratory supervision, their home life, childcare, academic duties. So to some extent, it was also seen as a burden. And then really importantly, also, we found that pretty much everyone felt that the pressure to travel, the assumption that we would all travel, were implicit, that there really were almost no conversations happening around when travel was a good idea and when it wasn't, and what travel had to do with climate change. So that was really important for us to hear. Now, when we shifted into talking about, okay, we've all stopped traveling, what's it been like for you to not go to conferences, to not travel for work? And we focused on specifically on conferencing. And we heard that faculty were having really mixed experiences. And I'm sure a lot of you know what we mean by that, that some of them said, okay, this is so convenient, it's amazing, I'm able to attend conferences I couldn't before. But they also told us that, look, this is less satisfying. I don't get to chat over coffee and meet new people. And so there was a little bit of frustration. But also really important is we heard that people were interacting with colleagues especially from the global South and low and middle income countries who previously could not attend conferences that were held only in person for financial reasons. So they felt that the switch to virtual conferences really enhanced equitable access. So we also asked our participants to sort of think ahead. Okay, assuming we're going to get through this pandemic and we go back to potentially traveling, what is that going to be like? So we heard from everyone that really that there's a consensus that travel is going to continue. It's important. We need to do it. But we also heard that there's a need for more explicit criteria that actually address this question of the climate impact of travel, when we should be traveling, how much should we be traveling. There was a sense of almost an acceleration. And in fact, we did learn that at UCSF, academic travel has accelerated dramatically in the last few decades. So our participants said, look, we really need to hear from our leaders how much does this matter? If I want to advance my career, are you expecting me to go to 10 conferences a year, or does that even matter? So this is a quote from one participant: how we're assessed as faculty has to change. And we also heard that expanding and creating more sort of better virtual and hybrid attendance opportunities really would have the potential to democratize meetings, so to enhance equity. So we developed 4 recommendations based on what we learned, because our goal is really to change our institution, but we wanted to also share these with the larger academic community. And they include really asking leaders to step forward and actually offer clear guidance about how important travel is for career advancement. Should a junior faculty member travel for 3,000 miles across the US to present a poster for half an hour, for example? We heard that as one example of frustration. So this is a quote from one participant: our system at UCSF for how you advance is in direct conflict with all these conversations we're having. These are conversations institution-wide about climate change, social injustice, decolonizing. Our second recommendation is that, and this is coming straight out of the mouths of our participants, we want to know what our carbon footprint is. We need to help our faculty and staff understand what that means. What does one flight mean? What's the equivalent? So we need greater visibility as the carbon footprint of different activities. And then third, really put more resources and support into hybrid formats for meetings and conferences. That might include really bolstering sort of innovative efforts to improve virtual meetings so they're more satisfying, they're more collaborative. How can we use hybrid formats to promote equitable access to professional meetings? And could we potentially establish a center of excellence in virtual communications? And then our last recommendation is to go outside our institution and offer solutions that might be able to be adopted by academic institutions. So we were really trying to convince UCSF here that, look, we could be the leader in this. So to help set precedent for other potentially, especially U.S. institutions, because we think that the U.S. is sort of behind Europe in these efforts. So just to mention before wrapping up that some of our ongoing efforts at my institution we are actually meeting with, surveying, talking to leaders. As we all know, culture change is hard, but we really think that we have to be talking about this collectively before anything's going to happen. Exhorting individual change, as Lorraine told us, doesn't usually work if the norms push against that. So we want our leaders to actually bring climate impact into the conversation with their faculty about travel, about attendance at conferences. We pushed our academic senate to create a theme year on sustainability and climate health. That brought a little bit more visibility to this issue. We are in the process of disseminating some calculators for our staff and faculty to use, although I think having one centralized calculator would be ideal. And we've also created a grant mechanism to provide financial support for virtual meeting attendance. And this includes conference registration and also childcare and other living expenses while you're at home attending virtual meetings. So we'll see how uptake lands there. And I just want to finish by saying this is the paper we published with our findings and our framework. And I want to thank all of my colleagues who worked on this. We had 2 medical students in particular who are collaborating with us on this effort. Okay, thank you, everyone. I'm going to cede control here, I think. Oh, well, I'll let Sydney do that.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Ackerman. I'm going to... Let's see, I think the last couple of slides may not have shown up for everyone, but I'm just going to advance as we kick off our panel discussion. So yes, everyone, please feel free to come back on camera. I want to thank each of you for really interesting, exciting, and stimulating presentations. I think there's so much we can talk about right now, and I'm excited that we do have a really nice amount of time to get into some questions. So just as another quick reminder to the audience, I do see a lot of questions coming in, but please feel free to use the Q&A to submit your questions at any time. I think we can just start off with a couple of quick clarifying questions for a couple of the speakers that have come in from the audience, and then we'll move into some broader questions for you all. So first, Dr. Ben-Ari, you gave our first presentation. One person in the audience is wondering if you can clarify whether your plane travel greenhouse gas calculations, whether they incorporated a radioactive forcing factor. Do you have a response for that?
Yes, they did. The background is that if you don't take into account the radiative forcing, you use an emission factor. And actually, if you take into account the radiative forcing, this emission factor can be multiplied by 2 or 3. So it's quite an important indirect effect of flying on the climate, and we did take that into account according to the scientific consensus, actually.
Great, thank you so much for clarifying. And let's see, there is another question specifically for Dr. Whitmarsh. Dr. Whitmarsh, did you investigate how or if climate conference or meeting organizers offer or suggested alternative options to attend events?
So our research was conducted before COVID, when we know that there were definitely fewer such things on offer. And we didn't explicitly, we weren't surveying conference organizers, for example. So, but of the survey that we did with scientists and researchers from all the different countries, we did ask whether they had chosen non-aviation modes of travel for work in the last year because of carbon footprint. And the climate experts, 38% of them had, versus 17% of non-experts had. So, but that is explicit. What we were asking was whether they swapped that on account of carbon footprint. So that I guess gives a bit of an indication. We also did ask about their perceptions of the quality of online virtual interaction and video conferencing, and broadly speaking, they were not hugely positive, but the experts were more positive about those options than the non-experts. So I guess I formed an opinion that the alternatives had lots of drawbacks, including the virtual options, but we didn't explicitly ask about the how widely available those were at that point.
Thank you for that response. I wanted to get into kind of what I see as a overarching point that has been brought up multiple times. I think we've seen from all of your presentations that increased knowledge about climate impact or the impact of travel on, climate change doesn't necessarily lead to behavior change. And that is not a new thing in the science of behavior change or behavioral social sciences. But I'm curious of your thoughts on how we can address that knowledge behavior gap, or if we should even try to address the gap. Do you think maybe we should be focusing on structural drivers of, flying behavior instead of trying to get people to reflect their knowledge in their actions? And I know, for example, Tamara, you mentioned that their high concern for climate change does not necessarily change flying behavior, and that climate change researchers in Lorraine's presentation fly more than non-climate change experts. So do either of you or Sarah as well want to kind of speak to that gap and ways that we can either address it or get around it?
Well, if I could just jump in. So an analogy that I like from my world is overprescription of antibiotics. We all know that doctors overprescribe antibiotics, and we have a global crisis of antibiotic resistance. And so there have been many, many attempts to change the behavior of clinicians to get them to prescribe less, and they usually don't work. And this is because the incentives to prescribe are actually far greater. If you look at, what could happen to a doctor if they make the wrong call, if the family's upset and it says, I'm going to sue you. So the public health consequences are far outweighed by the individual incentive to do the thing. And I think academic travel is exactly the same, that there's mismatched incentives. So increasing knowledge doesn't really have enough effect because the incentives to do the behavior are so great. And so they're obvious to us, right? And everyone else is doing it. This is why I think it has to kind of come from the top down to some extent. It has to be structural change. because it's not fair to ask individuals to be the pioneers when all their colleagues are out there, advancing their careers, and you're staying home because you're doing the right thing. That just makes you seem like a quirky oddball. So that's my take on it.
Thank you. And Lorraine, please.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. We need our institutions, that is our universities, our funders, but also the governments, to basically make alternatives to flying cheaper, more convenient, more attractive, that we're not incentivized to fly for work, that we are, that funders, for example, actually reward proposals that give consideration to sustainability rather than either being neutral or there being perverse incentives. So we need all of those kind of institutional and wider social things to change. The only thing I would say about information provision is that we did find, and that we know more generally, that giving people information about the environmental impacts of, say, flying, can build support for some of those policies. So it's not to say that it's a complete waste of time to kind of educate people about how bad flying is. It is worth doing that, but with the intention of hopefully building kind of support for institutions to actually put in place measures that can change behavior and change practices more widely.
That's great. Tamara, anything to add to that?
Yes, well, there are several things to say to your question. I guess one of the things that Lorraine and Sarah have shown, and that we also show in our data, is that those types of very carbon-intensive behavior are more often concentrated among senior staff, senior researchers. They fly longer distances, they fly more often, they also get probably more reward from flying. And we also find that older male researchers are often the ones that are the most opposed to transformative solutions, because they fear risks which are basically concentrated on competitive advantages, that they're going to lose their competitive advantages in the overall scientific competition. So this is complicated, because those people are also the ones who are the decision makers more often. So that's one point. The other thing I wanted to say is that the reason why it's actually very complicated to enforce mitigation policies is that there are very strong controversies that underlie those decisions. For example, in terms of flying, do you enforce a quota or a tax or other types of mitigation options? And there are political divergences in terms of how people are going to adopt or even accept those types of policies. And my feeling is that if those controversies are not acknowledged and incorporated in the overall discussion, people are going to agree on the overall statement that something should be done and that behaviors should change. But when you come up with a very practical solution, you don't get that much. People aren't in favor anymore. So those controversies are very important, and they should be acknowledged and they should be discussed. And I'm not sure that the people who are running science right now, whether research organisms or funding bodies, should have the right to decide on their own what types of mitigation option should be put forward. This is, I think, a common discussion.
Thank you to all three of the panelists for responding to that question. I'm curious what each of you see as kind of success examples of institutional policies or practices that have been put in place to support changes in academic travel, and how that has led to changes in the carbon footprint of academic travel or other types of changes. And what do you see as kind of key research gaps in that space in terms of how structural changes may change our flying behavior in science? Lorraine, would you like to kick us off an answer on that one?
Yes, I think I can identify maybe a funder in the UK that's starting to take this quite seriously. They're a little bit at the forefront, I would say, is the Wellcome Trust, who is a health research funder. And they have now said that as part of their funding criteria, they are asking researchers to show how they are addressing sustainability and reducing the environmental impacts of their research. So they are actually using that as a criteria for funding, and that's a very recent thing. So we don't know to what it's too early to say how effective that has been, but by incorporating that into the incentive structure, I would imagine that should start to be effective, and I hope other funders would follow suit. I think you see it seems to be a very sort of piecemeal approach across universities and research institutions as to whether and to what extent they are taking action to reduce flying. And the work that my colleagues have done has suggested that while there were lots of climate change emergency declarations a couple of years ago, and universities saying that they were going to cut their emissions radically over the next few years, in reality, they haven't done very much, and they have been very slow, particularly to address travel. And part of that is because there are lots of wider reasons why that's very difficult to do. In the UK, for example, a lot of our funding comes from international students, and effectively students from other countries subsidize students from our own countries. So universities are actually in this country going becoming bankrupt because it's already difficult to kind of the economic climate is very difficult, but they are increasingly reliant on international students. So actually, it's really difficult for them to do much to address flying in general. But so there are sort of some wider issues that make I can see lots of reasons why it's not happening as quickly as we would like.
Mm-hmm. Great. Tamara, do you have any other observations about effective structural policy changes or research gaps in that area?
Yes, I mentioned in the chat that there are several universities in Europe who have enforced bans on flying over short distances when you have a train solution for 4, 6 hours, 8 hours, up to 10 hours train ride. So this is very common. Perhaps a knowledge gap concerns fieldwork. And there have been some quite groundbreaking initiatives in France regarding oceanographic missions that are very much carbon intensive. And you have groups of scientists and even parts of institutions that are looking into the equipment of sails on oceanographic vessels. So that's much more perhaps original, I'm not sure how to say it, but much more important, because you have those scientists who use those vessels in order to gather data and make observation, and this is at the very core of their work, much more than conferences are, for example. And when offered with such a solution, the adoption rate might be very, very important.
Thank you. And Sarah, is there anything else that you'd like to add on that topic?
Well, yeah, I will just say that in the US context, I mean, one of the challenges is really the large geographic distances between institutions and conference venues. And I know there are some emerging strategies to address that, including rotating conference venues. And when the annual conference you go to is near you, it's easier to get to, and you can attend in a hybrid fashion if it's far away. I also would like to call out the NIH because the National Institutes of Health actually, now I think this was maybe motivated from the pandemic primarily, but a lot of us who've been sitting on review committees for a long time at the NIH and had to travel to Washington, D.C., for a one-day meeting and then back, which was so grueling and exhausting from the West Coast, have rejoiced at the NIH switching to virtual reviews. That has really probably has a huge carbon impact. So regardless of the motivation, I think we have to, mention that that's actually a really good shift. So I do think that will influence thinking more broadly around making our travel decisions more deliberate and decide, could this be done virtually almost as effectively? I think in the case of review committees, it is being done as effectively. That's my experience so far.
Great. Thank you so much for those points. I wanted to get into a question about what seems to be possibly a key research opportunity, and that's related to kind of methods and measurement. So, Tamara, you mentioned in your talk that you developed a method for, tracking the carbon footprint of certain research activities in France. And then I believe, Sarah, you also touched upon how measurement of the carbon footprint of UCSF has also been kind of a challenging undertaking. So I wonder if either of you have any thoughts on, how can we measure and track? What tools are available? Are they open source? Can people access them? And what is in development or under development now in that space? Maybe Sarah, we could start with you.
Well, I would love to hear others' ideas about tools, but I will say that the reason we're having so much trouble measuring at UCSF is because we use an online platform called Connexus to book travel, but it's optional, and we all hate it. So most of us just buy our ticket ourselves and then get reimbursed later. The institution has no way of tracking like where you're going, and so interestingly, so all the UC campuses and our entire statewide system use this service. UC Berkeley recently, for sustainability reasons, decided to force everyone to use the platform. You have to use it because we want to track carbon footprint. So there's, of course, huge outcry. So I actually think this is kind of humorous because we're talking, inconvenience versus actually being able to track carbon footprint. But that's how busy people are, right? They so don't want the inconvenience. So I think maybe the bottom line here is we have to make these tools more usable, and so that there isn't a great act of resistance just by doing some paperwork. But yeah, I'd love to hear about other tools because we've amassed like a list of maybe 20 different carbon footprint tools, and I feel like all of them are really tough to use because you have to fill out everything about your day-to-day life. And I don't know if any of our busy colleagues are going to use these tools. So I would love to hear if anyone has tools to recommend that might be more user-friendly.
Our tool is open source and online, and it's been adapted to the American context right now by a researcher at the STSCI, so in astronomy at ORA. So it might be available for the US and also England and Germany. The main part of the problem is that it's data intensive, as Sarah just said, and it's very time consuming. And what we have worked on in France, but I'm not sure it extends to other contexts, because in France is a very centralized country and all the research is public. So there are some functioning that we can rely on that perhaps doesn't apply to the US or England, in which we have kind of forced a research organism to provide the data for research unit in order to gain time. But for sure, it's one of the main issues. The thing is that in France, you have centralized information, and we're kind of fighting right now with public organisms so that they give us core data so we can directly process the data and not put much more pressure and more time-consuming imperatives to individual researchers.
Thank you, Tamara. That's great to know that some of those tools are open access and available for other countries as well. So thank you for sharing that. I wanted to move on to a different topic, and this question is going to be targeted to Lorraine, if you don't mind answering first. You mentioned in the end of your presentation about disassociating busyness from excellence. And then I believe, Sarah, you also mentioned how academic travel has been accelerating over the past few years at your own institution. So it seems like a lot of us feel that the pace of life is just very fast in general, and that it's no different for the pace of science. And I'm curious what you think, Lorraine, and then others, if you would like to respond, about how we can maybe move to a more intentional pace of conducting science and traveling, and maybe even embracing slow science in some ways. And I'm curious what you think of that. And again, Lorraine, if you want to kick us off.
Yeah, that's a really, really good point. We know that a lot of our behavior is driven by habit, by kind of unconscious factors. We don't necessarily actually think about, do I really need to travel to this thing? And if I do, is flying the right way to travel there? A lot of that's just kind of habitually driven. And so there's a lot I think we can do to draw that draw attention to that to people and make them more conscious. So in the Tyndall Centre for Climate Change Research, which I'm affiliated with, and I used to be a core researcher of, they were really, again, I'd say ahead of the curve here in terms of really trying to develop a low carbon research culture. So they put out kind of publications 15 plus years ago on this. And one of the things that they put together was a decision tool, basically, a kind of decision tree where it asks you a series of questions like, do I actually need to physically go to this conference or meeting? Or is there another option available, like an online option, I guess, or maybe just not going? If I really need to go, is there a different mode I can take? And so there was a series of questions that we were really trying to encourage researchers to ask themselves every time they got invited to, or it seemed like they needed to go somewhere. And there may be cases where the ultimate outcome was, well, I have young children and this is an absolutely critical piece of fieldwork I need to do, so I have to fly. So that might have been the ultimate outcome, still was to fly. But actually, we were expecting that by going through this process, you could actually weed out actually a lot of travel that is not essential, and certainly a lot of flying that was not essential. And I think actually these sorts of tools that were just mentioned can also make people conscious, especially if they actually do show the carbon footprint of the different options that maybe people are not necessarily conscious of when they're making those bookings. And another thing we did in the Tyndall Centre was also to show people where their carbon footprint was relative to other people in the centre. So every year you would basically get feedback on what was the total amount of carbon emissions from your travel and where do you rank compared to everybody else. And so I don't think they publicly named and shamed people, though that was a possibility. But to actually just draw attention to the fact that maybe you're actually doing more than other people was the intention there. So yeah, I think there's a lot we can do to try to make people more intentional in their decisions.
Thank you. Sarah, is there anything that you'd like to add to that?
Well, I really like what Lorraine just said about emphasizing the positive, right, and giving people positive feedback. I think that's an important strategy in my context, because academic medicine in the US has just become so much more competitive because there are fewer federal dollars that people are competing for. There are more people competing for fewer grant dollars. It's so stressful. The rate of burnout is enormously high. A lot of people are sort of leaving academic medicine because they're disenchanted with the healthcare system. They're exhausted by hunting for grants. So I think in that context, if it seems that the more you travel, the more likely you'll survive in your career, then of course you will travel more. So I do think we have to combine a more explicit assistance for academics, in making these decisions more deliberate, with potentially reward for prioritizing planetary health. After all, we're supposed to be working toward health. This is what the academic medicine world is supposed to be working on. So the irony is not lost on everyone that all of this travel contributes to planetary ill health. But I do think that we need some kind of reward system. We're really encouraging our institution to actually reward faculty in their career advancement for prioritizing planetary health. It hasn't gone anywhere so far. There's still, that's too big a cultural leap. But even talking about it, I think is one good step forward, because it's literally leading to extreme burnout among a lot of my colleagues. Not just the travel, but the travel in combination with everything else that's the demands that are put on people to keep their careers going.
Yeah, thank you for that. And Tamara, is there anything else that you'd like to add to that? Or if not, that is all right as well. It's a great discussion. I think we'll have time for maybe a couple more questions. And thank you everyone for putting questions in the Q&A as well. Lorraine, there is one question, if you could either repeat or perhaps paste in the chat the decision tree resource that you mentioned, that would be fantastic. And if any of the other speakers would like to share specific resources with the audience, you can feel free to use that chat function to paste things in there. I wanted to kind of get back to that theme of equity that's been brought up a few times. Actually, there's a concurrent session happening right now in track 1 about cultivating inclusivity in scientific conferencing. It includes kind of the global perspective in terms of who is able to access scientific events. But in terms of environmental sustainability, you know, many or most of individuals around the globe do not have any access to air travel and do not take any flights in a given year. And yet these individuals are often, you know, bearing the greatest brunt of the impacts of climate change. And so I'm curious about how each of you grapple with that intersection of environmental sustainability, but also like global equity. And when you're thinking about flying as a researcher from the US or the UK or France, how do you kind of think about that in the global scale? And what are some kind of needs in that space that you would like to maybe raise or bring up to the audience? And maybe we could start off with Tamara, if that's all right.
Sure. In our data, what we show is that structural inequalities are scale independent. What I mean is that if you look at the distribution of the footprint within a research unit for flying, you find that about 10-15% of the researchers have 65% of the total GHG footprint. And this is also true between research units among similar proportions. So this is within the global north, but you see that the inequalities that you've mentioned between the north and the south is also true within countries, within research units, and between research personnel. But the question for us is, do we need to reach equality? And we have evaluated in our article how much GHG can be spared if everyone sticks at the medium level of traveling emission among personnel. And you already spare close to 30% of GHG emission from traveling. So it's quite a powerful tool. But the thing is that, again, you have controversies. And what we hear a lot is that young researchers should travel more because they need to create their own network. But actually, if you look at the data from surveys, you see that young researchers do not want to travel. What they want is that senior researchers travel less. So you have the between North and South, but also intergenerational equity issues that have to be discussed.
Yeah, thank you so much for that response. Lorraine, would you like to add to that?
That was a brilliant response. I mean, we know that carbon footprints are massively unequal globally, and as Tamara's research shows, and our research as well, we see it absolutely mirrored within research communities as well. And as she pointed out earlier, the people that are making the decisions are not representative of the wider communities. And I think so it's disingenuous for those senior people to say that, you know, it's in the interests of young people that or early career researchers that we should not limit flying, when as Tamara says, those are the communities where we see more support for those initiatives. So yeah, I absolutely agree that this is a fundamental question about inequality, and that we need to engage, be much more, I think, inclusive in decision making is one of the implications for sure.
Thank you. And Sarah, is there anything that you'd like to add to that?
Well, only to say that I think the equity issues in travel are not visible enough. I just don't think most people even think about it or know that this is happening. And I mean, of course, in our focus groups, a lot of our faculty did mention it, but many did not. And the fact that they were self-selecting to talk to us about this topic, I mean, to me, that suggests we need to actually make this a more visible issue and connect it to the question of career advancement and planetary health. So I just don't feel like all those pieces are connected enough for most people. I was just curious. I don't know if we were going to talk about the question in that somebody put in about offsets. This is something that comes up a lot at my institution when we try to start conversations about this. So often people say, "Why are you hammering on about this? Let's just do offsets." So I'm just curious if Tamara and Lorraine, what you know about this. I mean, I've only just read in the popular press that offsets have kind of largely been discredited. But I'm anyway, if that's okay, Sydney, I'd just love to.
Yes, thank you. Please. Yeah. Tamara, would you like to kick us off with that?
Yes. The problem with offsetting is that it has been shown that you have an additionality issues, which mean the question is, would the offset would have occurred without this offsetting program? In other words, are offsetting programs efficient? And scientists and reports that target this question show that in an overwhelming number of cases, it isn't. So it's like 85% that is inefficient. The thing is that, so it's inefficient, and you have a market for those offsets. And in this market, you have offsets that are very cheap, $10 for a ton of CO2, and some that are much more expensive, $100 or $200 per ton of CO2. Actually, among environmental economists, the social cost of carbon can be evaluated up to $300 per ton of CO2. So you see, you have this market, you have inefficiency, and you have varying degree of prices and robustness in terms of actual compensation occurring, so GHG that are removed from the atmosphere. And most of the time, people aren't aware of this research, and they go for non too expensive compensation programs, whereas you could find more expensive local compensation programs that aren't tied with north-south geopolitical problems, in which you compensate in southern countries because the regulation is more loose than in northern countries. So my take on that is that for residual emissions, it's a good option if it's analyzed seriously and if it's done as much as possible locally.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Sarah, for bringing that into the conversation from the Q&A. That's a really important topic, I think. We have only a couple minutes left in the panel. And again, I want to really thank all of the panelists as well as the audience for a really engaging conversation. If it's okay with you all, I'd really like to end with a really quick question that I'd like each of you to respond to. And it kind of gets more to that question about academic culture. So you're each in a really interesting role. Not only are you doing research on academic travel, but you're also academics who probably travel once in a while. So I'm curious about your own approach to, deciding whether to attend a scientific conference or meeting, and how do you decide whether to attend in person or virtually if there is an option, and how you kind of just navigate this in your own life, and whether this has changed over time. And again, I know this is a very large question, but feel free to just give, whatever bit of response you would like to share with the audience in terms of how you deal with this topic in your own day-to-day life in academia. And perhaps we could start with Lorraine on this one, and then go to Sarah and then Tamara.
Yes, well, I think COVID, as Sarah pointed out, actually has been, in a sense, an opportunity to. There are now obviously lots more online options available to people, so that makes it a lot easier for then me to sort of say back to conference organizers, well, are you offering a hybrid option, because that they probably could, and it's just whether they want to kind of go to the extra hassle and to do that. And so generally I basically decline to actually physically go to anything outside of Europe, and just carefully accept things that seem important to go to, and would take the train basically. But we're lucky, of course, in Europe that we actually have reasonable alternatives to aviation. They always take longer and they are more expensive than flying, definitely. So it's not always easy to make those changes, those switches from flying, but there are alternatives to some extent. And I do get quite a lot of work done when I take those train journeys to other parts of Europe, but it does make me actually evaluate, do I really need to go to these conferences? So sometimes I will just say no.
Thank you so much. Sarah?
My approach is a lot like Lorraine's, but with the difference that I live on the West Coast in the US, and most meetings are in the Midwest or the East. So it's really tough, but I often do, if I'm asked to speak, for example, at a conference I wouldn't normally attend, I will say, if I can present remotely, I'd be happy to. So I tend to not want to travel to meetings that are not going to be highly productive for me in terms of collaborating with colleagues and having extra meetings. And then secondly, if I am going to travel a great distance, so for example, the East Coast, my in-laws live in the East Coast. I try to combine work travel with visits to family and personal travel as much as possible. So I've been away for like a month at a time, doing multiple visits, and it almost feels 19th century style travel to me in some ways, the long visit, but actually that's actually been really rewarding, especially with remote work being possible now, more than it was before.
Great, thank you so much. And Tamara?
I have the same kind of thinking than Lorraine and Sarah in terms of putting into relation the environmental costs and the scientific outputs and trying to get sense out of it. But in reality, I haven't been traveling by plane since quite a long time, but I'd be happy to do it. If I'd come to the US, for example, now it would be for a couple of months to actually stay there and work for a long time, so that I'm sure that I've participated in aggravating climate change at my own little very scale, but for reasons that I think are important enough.
All right, well, I want to say thank you one more time to all of our speakers for the fantastic panel and fantastic discussion. And thank you to the audience as well for being here. That concludes this panel session, but I want to invite you all to stick around for the next set of concurrent sessions that will begin at 2:30 Eastern, so in about 15 minutes time. There are two options for what you can attend next. In track 1, we have a panel discussion, a fireside chat on creating inclusive conference environments through disability inclusion and accessibility. And then here in track 2, we will have another session on the topic of environmental sustainability, and this is focused on redefining conferences, innovative formats for sustainable engagement. So to join the next session, just head back to the auditorium and then select the track you'd like to enter. And thank you all again very much. This concludes our panel discussion.
Thank you very much.